everybody this afternoon to the Housing and Neighbourhoods Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Can I remind everybody that the meeting will be webcast for live or subsequent broadcast on the Council's YouTube site, and that members of the press and public may record and take photographs except where there are confidential or exempt items. The first thing on the agenda, apart from that, is apologies. I've had apologies from Councillor John O'Shea, who's unable to attend today. Do we have any other apologies we're aware of? Okay, thank you very much for that. Declarations of interest. Can I remind members that they must declare all relevant pecuniary and non-pecuniary interests arising from any business that may be discussed at this meeting today. If this is declared, then you must not speak or take part in that agenda item. Any declarations will be recorded in the minutes. The item on the agenda is the action notes and action tracker, and we need to note that the action notes and action tracker on the 17th of February will be reported to the next meeting.
I just wanted to ask about the letter that's gone to Councillor Hussain about our views on the need to relaunch the localisation work.
Now, actually, because the officer has been taken ill, has that letter gone to you?
Yeah, apologies. Councillor Brother, I was under the impression, maybe incorrectly, that that was going to come from you to the cabinet after the last meeting. I thought there was a request that there was an update to be provided on it based on the discussion.
That's been done.
Yes,
the update's been done.
So where was the letter sent to me? Did you send it to John?
Yes, so that's, if could we?
Yeah, if you send it to me, I'll make sure that's actioned.
Right, okay. So I'll email you. Well, I sent it to you.
Yes, I've got it as well.
You approved?
Yes, so we've all approved it, so so I'll forward you.
Send it to me and I'll send it on.
Okay.
Maybe a letter from scrutiny
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
What
to
it
the
was,
cabinet member.
incorporating your comments. Yeah.
Yeah, so we did the updates for
Yeah.
it, so we just need to make sure that that's done.
Yeah.
It's
There's a
probably the
staff
officer being ill.
Yeah, there's an officer off unwell, and I think it's gone to the officer that's off work, and it hasn't quite got through to me. So if I can pick that up, if you send it through to me.
Okay, we'll make sure that if you send it and I'll send it too.
And then hopefully we get a response back.
Yes,
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So, next on our agenda, we have Bereavement Services. We've got several people in the room today. We've got Paul Lancaster, we've got Councillor John Cotton as well, so you're very welcome this afternoon. And we're going to take your report from Paul, from the Interim Assistant Director of Regulation and Enforcement, giving us an update of the issues around mortuary provision, registry office and the cemeteries and crematoria. So you're very welcome this afternoon, and we'll hand straight over to
Where do you like this? Just
anywhere you like, anywhere you're comfortable.
okay. Thanks, Chair. I'm just going to say a few things and then hand over to Paul, whose name this report is. I took on responsibility for Bereavement Services and the Registry Office at the end of summer of last year. Been very conscious of just what an important service this is for so many of our citizens. You know, it deals with people at times that can be incredibly challenging and emotional for them, and also at some of the most important points of their life as well. And what's also really clear, having taken on portfolio responsibility for this, is the extent of how challenging this period that the service has just been through, utterly unprecedented when you think of the impact of the pandemic, not just in operational terms, but also just in emotional terms as well. And I'd really just like to put on record here my enormous thanks to the staff in those services for what they've been doing through an unprecedentedly challenging time. They've done a tremendously good job. The report gives some detail about some of those challenges and how the services work through those, and Paul can certainly expand upon this because he's been involved with it for rather longer than I have. But as we emerge from the pandemic, looking at the consequences for the service and what that means for the future, and there's just a couple of things I wanted to flag up really about where we take things from here. So one is the importance of partnership working. That has come across loud and clear during how we've dealt with the circumstances during the pandemic. It was absolutely crucial to how we dealt with some of those challenges around change to burial arrangements, changes to the operations of the registrations of births and deaths. And we want to use that partnership to build stronger services for the future. So it's very much about how we work with families and citizens, how we work with our colleagues and partners in the funeral director community, the work that we've done with voluntary and faith communities in particular. I mean, that worked really effectively, I think, when we were dealing with some of those real challenges, and we're now seeking to keep that going. And some of the work we're doing with voluntary and community groups, many of whom have a direct interest, particularly in the issues of bereavement. We've got a bereavement services round table which brings all of those actors together, and that's very much about how we work jointly, how we co-design our approach to bereavements and registration services in the future, and also using those partners as critical friends to the council. So being able to have that sometimes challenging but detailed dialogue around what's working, what needs to change, what we need to improve, and what we can work on together. And that shaped something called the Bereavement Services Charter, which we're going to try and attach to the papers, but I don't think made it through. So Paul's brought some old school hard copies of the Charter, which will now seamlessly circulate. We've worked together on shaping the commitments in the Charter. It sets out, some standards that citizens can expect, our partner organisations can expect, and the aspirations that we have for delivering improved services to the people of this city. The other thing that's really important to the partnership working space has been the campaigning work that we work with together, organisations like Road Police, so changing our approach to families who've been bereaved by road crashes, the work that we do with Cruise Bereavement Care, and organisations like the Edwards Trust, who are also based here in Birmingham. The other thing is getting us on a footing for the future, so very investing in our services going forward. You'll have seen that in the last couple of weeks we put money into the extension of the cemetery in Kings Norton. We've got the renewal of the crematoria facility at Yardley underway as well. And there's also other major works that are built in as part of the council's wider 25-year asset plan. So we're trying to do a range of things here, working with the city and its partners, and also putting some money in to ensure that the bereavement estate, for want of a better term, is fit for purpose and able to provide those services to the people of the city. So I will close at that point. I don't know, Paul, do you want to add anything?
Just a few things, if I may. Firstly, I would say that we are in a backdrop at the moment of a very difficult recruitment climate, which is right across the board. I think right across the city we're finding it very difficult to actually get staff in, whether it be through agency or permanent basis. That has caused some issues. Second thing is that the deaths have slowed down marginally in the last month, but actually deaths were still in 2020. They were a few hundred more than in 2021, which gives you an indication of how much, and that was 25% more than we normally had. The mortuary side, I would say that we've learnt on the job with the pandemic, and we've improved our capacity, but the long-term aim is to get a much better centre built. And there'll be more coming on about that post the elections, I think, because we're just looking at all the different partners, and we'll be preparing something for it. On bereavement services, I would just say, I think last time I came, we had it was actually by a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, and we were talking about Handsworth and flooding, I believe, was the last time. I can really grateful to inform you that actually the investment we put in at that time to improve the land drainage, we have not had any flooding anywhere within that area since that time. But obviously the thing about bereavement services, we have usable space for those who have burial space. We are currently just doing, just to give you an indication, as mentioned there, Kings Norton, where we're investing the extension of the cemetery. That is nearly used up, what we've got at the moment. We've used about 5 years' supply in the last couple of years. So that's part of the extension work that's required. We're also looking at Quinton Cemetery, and I know the chair would be interested to know that, even if it's for a few weeks.
No, it's actually
Outside your patch, yes, yeah.
Quinton.
But you're nearest to it, I think, if it's in Dudley. That one, we're looking at putting a Muslim section in there, and that really is like a replacement of what was at Handsworth, because it was a well-used cemetery there. Sutton Newhall is being used like we've not ever seen, to be quite honest with you. The use of Sutton Newhall has been immense over the last year. And when I first went there, I think it was just right at the end. We're now 3 sections up in terms of a lot of work that's been done there. And one of the things we're trying to instill in staff is that the portfolio holder and I are visiting the cemeteries, and we're going round and we're asking the staff, what's that? And new eyes going in and saying, why is that not good? That's not what we would expect. So we're trying to improve our whole offering, because it's very difficult to actually always maintain, with the weather we've had, really good standards, but we are doing our best to, and the staff care an awful lot. The other thing that I was going to say was that, just to give you an indication, we've not managed, you might hear from time to time that people say they can't get bookings at funerals. It simply isn't true. Every time we get a request, we actually say to the member of the public, we can do a funeral here, 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 here. And I got one recently said it's 3 weeks until we can book a funeral. Wasn't true at all. It was the availability of the funeral director. And so there is that whole market working together. We're trying to get closer to the funeral directors so that we can see it as a whole, if you like, a whole system, that we're all in this together. And generally that's worked well, but occasionally you'll hear that. We are more than happy to provide any information to members of the public. If they say, why can't we provide, we will give that to them. We're pretty much up to completely opening up now post the pandemic, even to the stage where backfill burials are now allowed. And one of the few things we're not doing is in relation to cremations, where we're maintaining the closure of curtains at cremations because of the public going up there, putting their hand on it. If someone is happening to have COVID, they pass it on. And that's something so that we're maintaining that bit, being cautious. I think with regards to the registration, just so that you're aware, the new system that the government put in place worked fabulously well. It enabled us to cope with the demands. However, the Coronavirus Act runs out in just a couple of weeks, which will mean for a period of time, we will have to go back to face-to-face death registrations. We are anticipating in the summer, or early summer, late spring, early summer, that there will be time in the parliamentary calendar to allow the change back to what's happened during the pandemic, where we could do that differently. So that's something that's in place to happen. Apart from that, Chair, can I just, and I know the staff would want me to thank all the members who have visited and all the members who've actually spoken to the staff and given them support. It's meant an awful lot to the staff, I have to say, and they do welcome organised visits for members if you ever want to go round. And I know there's 1 or 2 members who have been to different ones here in the room, and you'll actually know that we do welcome people coming in to actually see what's going on. Thank you, Chair. I don't think I needed to say anything more, but just happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much for that. And can I pass on this committee's thanks to the staff and people working in the service, because it must have been incredibly difficult 2 years. I know it was difficult for members of the public as well, and I acknowledge that to citizens, but I think under the circumstances, the service, was maintained and carried on well. I think that's the question.
Thank you. Can I first say how refreshing it is to see a director and a cabinet member in person rather than on a screen. I certainly hope that it becomes a bit more of the norm moving forward. Certainly on behalf of our group, and especially on behalf of myself, I'd like to express my thanks to all the staff in Bereavement Services. From the registrations and to the cemetery workers, to the crematorium staff, they all did a fantastic job under very difficult and at times challenging circumstances. But they always maintained that level of dignity. And I think that says an awful lot for our staff, especially when, I certainly went round all the cemeteries and the crematoria and met the staff who, whilst maintaining that dignity, you also had to listen to the unfortunate stories of the abuse that they've had to endure. So, certainly on behalf of us, I'd like to pass on a huge thank you. What the visits did show, and it's something that Paul's touched on, is that unfortunately it did highlight a lack of investment. It's almost as if, I suppose, bereavement services is something that we really don't want to talk about, and it's always been at the bottom of the pile. But certainly the pandemic brought it to very much up to the top of the tree. So the drainage issues, having to turn up a hand for and see families building dams to divert water was not a pretty sight. So I'm glad that that's been sorted, Paul, and I know that we did a lot to try and sort that out. So it is refreshing to see the proposals for investment. It's also good to hear what you just said about questioning standards. What's this, what's that? I believe in the NHS there is a saying or a standard going around, is that you accept the standard that you walk past. Maybe that's something we should adopt in the city and get that across to our staff and our members, that you accept the standards that you walk past. Picking up on the tours or the visits that Paul had mentioned, yes, I would certainly recommend members have go and visit the staff. They do appreciate it. They are very enthusiastic in some places about the role that they play, and I would certainly suggest that you be prepared to be shocked, just purely and simply because you've seen how the machinery works, etc. So it's a bit of an eye-opener. But yes, just to finish off, it's great to see the investment. I think we've learned a lot, but the main thing is to say a huge thank you to the staff. And just to finish off, picking up on what Councillor Cotton said about joined up thinking and working, that was vital even across the political parties during the pandemic. There was a lot of cross-party working with Councillor Thompson, and it was very much appreciated the way that she communicated with us. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Councillor Sharp.
Very quick, please, Joan. Paul, you said about 25% increase in funerals.
Yeah.
Was they all COVID related?
No, they weren't, and it seems that we went through several phases. It was quite clear what stage of a wave we were at by the, if you like, the group from which the deceased came from. It was quite clear going through the pandemic. But what's happened I would say in the last 6 months, far less COVID deaths, but actually far more, if you like, other deaths related, possibly from issues around treatments that people weren't able to get during the pandemic. That would be a hypothesis of mine rather than a fact, but I would actually say that's probably likely in terms of what's happening.
The reason I'm asking, because every time you see it reported, it's always COVID. And I think that people tend to forget that people have other illnesses, and die of other illnesses. And I just think we don't get that over enough at times.
I think at the worst time it was about 40% of deaths for COVID.
Yeah.
But it pulled back, and if I went online, I could probably give you the figures.
No.
That, so I've got that on a spreadsheet that's live, if you like.
And my final one is, I understand that there's no more burials now taking place at Whitton Cemetery. Do you know if that's true or not?
The only burials that probably would be in Whitton that would be reserved graves or opening up of graves where they're double graves. I'd have to check. I thought there was still one or two, but I don't think there's a lot left within Whitton. We will have the 3 main cemeteries across the city All the others have got reserve graves or double graves that opened up. And the three will be Sutton Newhall in the north, Quinton to the west of the city, and Kings Norton to the south of the city. And that would be the three that we would have available in terms of that. And they will give up to 30 to 40 years provision.
It's all right, I was just asked by one of the neighbours the other day, I said I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I think it's probably because we've sold, well, I know we were close to the end of that, of any free, I'm pretty sure it's reserved graves only.
Okay, thank you. Cheers, Chair.
Councillor Locke.
What about Lodge Hill Cemetery? Was that?
That is the same. It's normally the opening up of pre-reserved graves. As soon as we allow any reserved graves, they get bought very, very quickly. And that's certainly the case at Sutton Newhall. One of the things that we're trying to do is to create a section that is for reserved graves. So we know those are the reserved graves, and we can then ensure they're in order. Because one of the things that we've learned with Handsworth, we allowed reserved graves, but because they were specified, we have to hand dig a lot of them because people don't die in the order they reserve them, do they? So it actually can't get a machine to it. So we're trying to organise our work so that we can give a better service for reserved graves, particularly at Sutton Newhall. We'll do the same at Quinton, and we'll do the same at Kings Norton once we get to that stage. Kings Norton's got no reserved graves on sale. We haven't got anything like that at the moment. But Lodge Hill is the same. I believe it's just, it's pretty much used up apart from reserved graves and opening up.
So, also going on deaths as well. I mean, you can't really know about it, but there are maybe people who possibly died who may or may not have had COVID and, may not have been jabbed or whatever, they may not have, test and trace or something like that.
Well, there was no diagnosis. The issue related to COVID, and probably if you spoke to the coroner would be most concerned that COVID was being blamed for deaths that actually weren't COVID related. That was a greater issue, to be quite honest with you, because that had the potential for possibly being an unexplained death covered up, which obviously is her role. But generally, if people were, the rules have changed so that if it appeared that COVID was a part of the cause or the cause of a death, then the coroner would not investigate it, but it required a local doctor or a hospital doctor to indicate that COVID symptoms were present and it was likely it was a COVID death.
Just finally, Chair, the emergency ways of working that were brought in and that are soon to. I mean, I think in some ways it would be good to sort of look at new ways of working as well, although it's great to have face-to-face as well, but we must utilise, meeting when we can, or, make it easier for people as well.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm going to say to you that it's the foresight of the portfolio holder that the assistant director's here today, because he asked me to come along in person. But yeah, no, I mean, I take the point. Well, I think as officers we're willing to attend as need to be. That's generally the case.
Much better in person, I agree. But for staff working as well, it's.
Yeah, we have a hybrid system generally where people are either working in an office or in or at home, and the reason we're doing that just purely is COVID infection, because it could knock a whole cemetery staff out if we're all working together. So that's partly what's happening, and we have a lot of staff who are vulnerable, and so therefore we have to watch and look after them.
But a great asset to this system. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Harmer.
Could I just first add my thanks to staff for the huge amount of work that was done and the speed at which things were moving extremely quickly back 2 years ago, and the speed at which things were put in place to ensure that people would still be buried with dignity was extremely impressive, and my thanks to everybody who was involved in that. A couple of specific questions. First of all, on births, the report says that the backlog actually is growing again at the moment, is up to 3,000, and also points out that when the Coronavirus Act is taken off the statute book, then people won't be able to claim child benefit or universal credit prior to the birth being registered. So and obviously for people who are suffering as many, well, everyone will be with the cost of living issues, getting a prompt payments on both of those will be extremely important to people. So are we confident that we can actually deal with the backlog before the Act is removed from the statute book? And if not, how much longer will it take so that we can ensure that time period is minimised, that people have to wait for registration and then payments? And the final little one was just on, could you give an update on the situation with badgers at the RD Cemetery? Which is, it's interesting because it's one of those issues where you get equal amount of email on both sides of the argument, and very passionate on both sides of the argument as well. So obviously things do have to be dealt with properly. And I just wonder, because clearly we're now in the season when you can't do anything, and where things now are with that issue.
Right, thank you for that, and thank you for the kind comments. Right, the first one in relation to births, I honestly could not promise when we were caught up with the backlog, and there's two simple reasons on that. Firstly, that births are not as high a priority for the GRO, the National sort of organisation overseas registrations, as deaths. Deaths need to be dealt with quickly because you can't bury or have a funeral until you've actually registered. We've had a few different issues on births, and it just really has been, we've got a fixed number of staff, we're moving staff around, and it's not easy to actually bring in new staff because they've got to be trained and go through a qualification to do that, and there isn't an ready availability of people. Although we have, we've been doing things to try and help, working with colleague authorities who don't have such a great number of births and deaths as Birmingham has, and so we've been entering into a mutual aid arrangement. So that's been done pretty much for the last year. We've been doing a mutual aid arrangement to try and reduce that backlog. It was just simply that every time there's a wave, we have to take people off birth registration onto death registration, and that's what keeps doing it. And if you notice, it was that the actual date was about the 25th of March when the restrictions were put in and there was going to be no birth registrations. That was ceased. 25th of March 2020 till the 1st of June gave us 6,000 births at that time. And we were just full scale, just doing death registrations. There were no marriages, there were no citizen ceremonies. So actually what's happened, they saved all of those ones up effectively. So when that was taken off, they all came in as well. And we're trying to actually manage that with a finite resource. And it's not because we can't get, that we haven't got the money to get more people, it's that we can't fill the vacancies. And then we've had sickness over the last period. So realistically, the most difficult part for us to clear will be the births backlog. But I'm looking at that on a daily, weekly basis, saying, right, what's going on? How's it going there? And there's been a current, since Christmas, we've had about 10% of the staff off with COVID-related infections, sort of going from there. So
what's the waiting time at the moment?
I can't give a waiting time. It's one of the questions I know has been raised for council this time, but we actually can't answer that because we never record the waiting time. The performance indicator for birth registrations is the percentage of those registered within 42 days, because that's the legal limit.
Right.
But we can't say how long could it work? Do you go from when the child is born, or do you go from when someone approaches the register office for an appointment, and then they're away for 2 weeks, so they can't actually go to that? It's not a true parameter to look at, but the registration within 42 days is, I think in the first year, the 2020 onwards, when there was a lot of issue in getting registrations, those who missed the registration because they were, it was not open. It's been hard to get those people in. The transient population, they move elsewhere. And so we have still got some that are some way out, which have been referred to the GRO for assistance. But actually we haven't managed to crack that one, but we're doing our best.
Can I just ask, while we're on that subject before we move on to badges, are there children who will have slipped through the net, and are we going to be in a position in a few years hence where parents might be trying to register unregistered children into schools or nurseries or for inoculations or whatever? Is that going to be a problem that may rumble on for a number of years?
You used the word may. That may well be the case in all circumstances, because I can't definitively say yes to all of those questions. My suspicion is it's probably yes.
I mean, that might become a concern within children's services.
It's something we need to give some thought to.
The potential missing children in the system is something we've been worried about from the beginning.
We've got Councillor Thompson on the call, so she might pick that up. So perhaps you can bring us a big caveat.
I'm sure Councillor Thompson will take me to task later on.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
And badges. Right, so we had 6 active sets within the cemetery. We dealt with 5 of them by using something called badger gates, which meant the badgers could come out of the set, but then they couldn't get back in. 1 set were unsuccessful because the little darlings managed to find out how they could keep the gate open to get themselves back in there. So we've got 1 set that was there. So they are still there. It's fair to say there's far less activity, and we've had no circumstances since we did that work of any upset of graves. I think it's probably a diplomatic way to say that. So I think that's where it is. But it is, as you know, you've gone around the cemetery there. There's been a lot of activity, and it's got worse and worse. I would emphasise that the City Council did not seek a licence to cull the badgers. It was purely to relocate them through them looking for alternative food supply. That was.
We don't physically relocate them.
No,
they decide where they want to go.
Yeah, in much the same way they came into ours.
Yeah, exactly.
We were going to build a fence down one side of the cemetery because that was where they were coming in. Now that's a fence that's as, if you like, tall above ground and below ground, because that's what's needed to stop them from burrowing under. But that we put on hold until such times as we can look for an extension of the licence to deal with the last remaining set. That won't be till June because of birthing and the mating season for badgers.
Thank you very much. And finally, I think that's
Paul, I echo everything what Councillor Tudor said, and regards to hard work done by the staff during the pandemic. Question I want to ask, you mentioned about these reserve grades, and digging. Obviously, that takes longer, digging the grave, it takes time.
Yes.
What is this time scale on that? How many days people have to wait before you can prepare that grave?
Okay, that can vary, but if I take us back, when a person reserves a grave, the contract that they go and enter into says that there won't be any burials at the weekend. Now those contracts have been going for a long time. We are reviewing all of those, so that I want to sort of say that life has changed since those contracts were put in place, and there's far more expectation, particularly for religious needs, for a more urgent burial. So what we're trying to do at the moment is we're trying to say the maximum would be if a person dies on the Thursday, we would seek, if we possibly can, to get the person buried on the Saturday. We normally can't if it's a hand dug. If it's an excavator dug, it will be done on the Friday. If it's someone dies and it can't be hand dug or whatever, we're not leaving it anymore. It's happened in recent times when we said no more to it. It won't happen. They won't be buried till Monday, or that's not going to happen. The other thing we've had to do with our staffing issues is we've had to open the burials on certain days. We've had to have spaced out burials because we're trying to service the main cemeteries. So I would anticipate that normally you do the burial within 48 hours, hopefully 24. So that's what we aim for anyway.
Councillor Alden, and then I'll take Councillor Wood.
Just following on from that, how many slots do you have to keep vacant in case somebody wants one in 24 hours?
We don't. If I take what we're doing at Sutton Newhall, because it might not be an easier explanation. When we've got a row, we actually tended to the ones who ask for reserve graves. One of them, they're at the ends of the roads, so we move out from the middle, if you like. If there's no reserves with that, we just go from one end to the other. So that's why we're saying we're looking at different ones, and we're saying to families, because we sometimes get 10 or 12 booked of the actual graves are reserved, and we say to them, you'll have to go with the order we tell you, so you can't guarantee that a husband might be right next door to the wife if they die after 3 other relatives, for instance, who've got that thing there. It is a logistical nightmare, to be quite honest, and it's something that we've been trying to sort of contact those who reserve graves more to say, let's work this through, see how this works. That's what we're trying to do. But when they were reserved in days gone by, they were just reserved. So if someone came and said, my partner, spouse has passed away, I've booked that one, I want to book the one next to it. No thought was given about the need for machinery to actually get in, to actually dig that. It would have to be hand dug if that's the middle of the road. If it's the end of the road, it's fine. We can deal with the machines.
That's quite interesting, thank you.
Councillor.
Yeah, just one quick one, going back to your staffing difficulties. When we go back to, when the system goes back to having to do face-to-face registrations, how are you going to handle that with the move towards flexible working?
We will. What we're doing is we're doing it rotated, and we open they call it the births appointments calendar or the death appointments calendar. We just get them booked in so that they're going through to do that. What I think the way we have to move forward, there's a real need to grow our own people. And I think that we will be looking very heavily at apprentices and others from the local community. So we also get staff that represent the local community in terms of the makeup. And that's starting almost immediately. Now we're coming out of the pandemic. We are actually actively trying to get that.
And has anybody else got any further questions? No, thank you very much for coming along. It's been really, really helpful.
The only thing I would say as well, Chair, is that the only other thing that not really part but linked to this part of the Opium Group Scrutiny Committee. You may have seen the pictures yesterday, but the Coroner's Court is now open. So the new Coroner's Court, we were ashamed of the old one, and the new one was one that the Chief Coroner, who for the first time I think visited Birmingham, came and said it was second to none around the country. So I think that the members should take a real pat on the back for agreeing to go ahead with that.
I think his words were, "This is the future." So it's going to be very impressed, and it is incredibly impressive set of facilities, and it will be really good, I think, for people that go for that very traumatic experience and for going to a coroner's inquest.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you, for listening today. And I think, as a committee, we are just required to note this report, so that is duly noted. Thank you. So the next item on our agenda this afternoon is the housing allocations review. I'm not sure exactly who we've got. I think, have we got Julie? Excellent, Julie. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. We've got Julie Griffin, who is the Director of City Housing, and I know we have a presentation that was prepared by Housing Services Manager Hayley Prime. So I'm just going to hand over directly to you, Julie, if that's all right. Oh, I think you might be on the mute. So we just get. Oh, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Just hold on a minute. Okay, can you still hear me? Excellent. Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Chair. So I'll just introduce the paper first. As part of City Housing's improvement journey, and specifically focusing on those that are vulnerable and in housing need, and to support the new housing solutions operating model, we have reviewed the housing allocations policy. The policy that you're going to have a presentation on today will be going to Cabinet on the 22nd of March, hopefully for final approval. It has been out to consultation for a number of weeks. What we're aiming to do is to simplify the process and to ensure that the people with the most need actually reach the top of the housing register in order to receive an allocation. As you also are aware, we are receiving unprecedented demand for social housing in the city. We've got over 21,000 people on the housing register currently, and we're receiving 500 new applications every single week. But we're only probably able to rehouse just over 3,500 per year into our council housing properties. So what we've done is carried out a complete review of the allocations policy, with a view to it becoming simpler for people to apply and simpler to understand, and also ensuring that we balance the needs of those that are most vulnerable into trying to allocate them to a very scarce resource. So I'm going to hand over to Hayley Pram, who's actually led the project, and she'll give you an overview of the changes to the policy. Thank you, Hayley. I'll share my screen if that's okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair. I'll wait for Julie to share the presentation and then I'll start. And if it's okay with you, I'll do the presentation first and then we can have questions at the end.
That's fine. Everyone happy with that? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll just give you some brief background. So as the first slide says, it is a requirement under Part 6 of the Housing Act for every local authority to have and publish an allocation scheme and to ensure that all properties are allocated in accordance to that scheme. It is also best practice to review a housing allocation scheme every few years to ensure that we are fully compliant with law and good practice. The current scheme that we have was implemented in 2017. It was amended in 2018 in line with the introduction of the Homeless Reduction Act. But it hasn't been reviewed since then. The next slide, please, Julie. So as Julie's already said, we completed a full review on the current allocation scheme that was completed over the course of 2021. And we produced a report which published the findings. The main recommendations of the review were that the current scheme needs updating to ensure compliance with legislation, and that that is one of the major things we need to do, as we do get a lot of inquiries from solicitors. We get a lot from the Ombudsman, and frequently have to attend judicial reviews because the current scheme is not fully compliant with legislation. We also need to make some minor adjustments to the scheme regarding processes and procedures. And we also need to update our nominations agreements that we have with the registered providers, again, to ensure we are compatible with legislation. Next slide, please. Okay, so from a national context, every local authority has a duty to allow any member of the public to apply to join the scheme. Now, that does not mean that every member of the public has to be admitted onto the scheme. They just have a right to apply. They still have to meet the eligibility and qualification criteria. For those who do not and are not accepted onto the scheme, then housing advice is given to those applicants, and they may be signposted to alternative housing providers. The local authority also has a power to have a nomination agreement with all the registered providers within the city, and we also have the power to determine the qualification criteria, the degree of choice. In Birmingham, we operate the Birmingham Choice Scheme, which is a choice-based letting scheme where we advertise our properties. And applicants can then bid on those properties, so they have a choice of what they are actually applying for. We have a right to decide who should be afforded an additional preference, and I'll come to that in a moment on the next couple of slides. And we are also able to determine the prioritisation of applicants when allocating our social rented housing. So we have two preference groups that we have to consider. The first one being a reasonable preference group, and this group is what is determined by law, and we have to give reasonable preference to these groups of people. So they are people who are homeless, people occupying insanitary or overcrowded accommodation, people who have a need to move on medical or welfare grounds, including disability, and people who need to move to a particular locality where failure to move would cause hardship to them. And those are the categories that we have to consider by law. In addition to that, each local authority can then determine their own additional preferences, and these will be different across the country and for every local authority, and they are normally determined dependent upon the demand and the need in a particular area. So some areas, if I look at one of the categories on there, I won't read them all through to you. I'm sure you've had copies of the slides. So if we look at a category of leaving the care of Birmingham Children's Trust as an example, you could have a small borough authority who do not have any allocations made to children who are leaving care. So they may not have that as one of their additional preferences. So those additional preferences are determined by the local authority themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we're going to propose banding in the new policy, the current policy has 4 bands, band 1 to 4, with 1 being the highest priority. What we are proposing is we are going to keep 4 bands, but they are going to be labelled in a different with different criteria. Band A will be for people who have an extreme need to move because they have one of the reasonable preferences and one of the additional preferences that I mentioned earlier. Band B will be people who have an urgent need to move because they are entitled to a reasonable preference. Band C are people who need to move, but it's not urgent, but they also have a reasonable preference. And then band D is a new band that we're looking to introduce. And this will be for people who have exhausted the right to refuse an offer of accommodation, or they have failed to bid where a suitable property would have been available. In the current scheme, that group of customer is currently disqualified, whereas this way, if we just demote them to band D, they will still sit on the register. So if we look at the main proposed changes, the first ones are around qualification, the main one being local connection. So currently, an applicant has to have a local connection of a minimum of 12 months with Birmingham. And how we determine local connection is done in various ways. Mainly it could be living in the city currently, working in the city, having immediate family members, having employment, education in the city. We're looking at increasing that connection to 2 years rather than 12 months, and that is to fall in line with government guidance. Another difference is homeowners. We are currently in the current policy, all homeowners are disqualified, and we are going to keep that category. However, there will be some minor exceptions for homeowners who are subject to compulsory purchase orders or prohibition orders, or those who are subject to domestic abuse. Oh, sorry, if we go back to local connection, there are exemptions there regarding homeless, those subject to extreme violence or domestic abuse, and armed forces personnel. Another new category that we are looking at bringing in is worsening of housing conditions. So this is where we can prove and we are satisfied that an applicant has worsened their housing conditions deliberately in order to either gain a higher priority on the waiting list or to be eligible for a larger sized property. With regarding to banding, we aren't making a great deal of changes, but we are taking the opportunity to address some of the issues that we have in the city. So the main ones here are homeless priority, who are owed the main duty. So these are applicants who have been accepted as homeless because they meet the criteria. In the current scheme, they are in band 2. And we are looking at increasing their priority to band A. We have properties that are subject to compulsory purchase orders. Currently, in the current scheme, they have 2 bands. So if the property is required within 6 months, they are band 1. And if the property is required in a longer time frame, they are in band 2. So to improve consistency and fairness across the board, we are going to award band A. We have occupying private rented sector properties that are insanitary or unfit. They are currently band 1 in the current scheme, but we're proposing to reduce their priority to band B. And the reason for that is so that they fall in line with other tenure types, because in the current policy, other tenure types, that could be a homeowner as an example, they could be still living in unsanitary or unfit housing conditions, but they are in band 2. So we want them, everyone to be treated fairly and consistently. So that is the reason for that proposal. We have a child in need where staying in the property would be at risk to the child, and the child is subject to a child protection plan. In the current scheme, they are in band 2, and we are proposing to increase them to band A to give them a higher priority. And then the final one, as I've mentioned, is the band D for refusals. So what we are proposing there is anyone in band A, as they have an extreme and need to move, will be allowed 1 refusal, and applicants in bands B and C will be allowed 2 refusals. When they reach that limit, they will be demoted into that band D, where they will stay for a period of 12 months, unless, of course, they have another housing need that's urgent that arises, and then they will be looked at and reassessed accordingly. Thank you. So we completed a 12-week public consultation that was held between November and February. We consulted with all our registered providers, stakeholders and partner organisations, our service users, the residents, West Midlands Combined Authorities, all elected members, Birmingham's Children's Trust, Adult Social Care and employees of the City Council. The key findings that we had back from the consultation were positive and mainly in agreement with the proposed policy. We had initial feedback from the Children's Trust concerning the priority for a child in need, which is one of the reasons why we increased that from band B to band A. For those who disagreed, their main concerns were regarding overcrowded and bedroom need. However, these comments mainly came from our service users. So they were a lot of them were indicative of their own circumstances. Just a quick chart there. It just shows all the questions at the bottom were the questions that we asked as part of the consultation. We asked around local connection, about the residence exemptions for local connection, that being for armed forces, domestic abuse, homeless applicants. A question around homeowners being disqualified, those of worsening housing conditions. We asked about the bedroom standard. We used the government bedroom standard to assess overcrowding and for allocations. We have the overcrowding on there, the child in need, compulsory purchase, all these that I've mentioned. And the only ones that I haven't mentioned previously were we are looking at doing assisted bidding and auto bidding for those applicants on the register who may struggle with doing that themselves. Refusals, I have covered, bedroom need, and the only other change was around affordability, where we are looking at doing affordability and budget checks. I will add that is not really around preventing anyone from being allocated a property under affordability. It is more for to give the applicant an awareness around budgeting and what their priority debts are, and the importance of paying the rent on top of other items that they may wish to purchase. So as you can see from the chart, strongly agree and agree were the left columns, and disagree and strongly disagree were to the right. So you can see from there that the majority were in agreement with the proposals. Thank you. So the next steps for us, as Julie's mentioned, the Cabinet report will be going to Cabinet on the 22nd of March. There has been an equality impact assessment completed, which has been presented to Star Chambers on the 24th of March. We are hopeful to commence mobilisation of the scheme in April 2022, obviously subject to Cabinet approval, with the hope to implement the scheme in autumn of 2022. And that's the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, please do ask.
Thank you, Hayley, and thank you for that comprehensive presentation. So thank you back to you, Chair. Thank you. If there's any questions that the board would like, the committee would like to ask us.
That's very useful. Thank you very much. I think we've got Councillor Wood.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. obviously it's logical that we keep reviewing the way that the allocations are handled, because the demand's always going to outstrip supply. So that's welcome. You say that on the local connection, the increase from 12 months to 2 years, how does that compare with our neighbouring authorities?
Yeah, the majority of our neighbouring authorities and the combined authorities use similar timeframes. The government guidance is so it falls in line with the homeless legislation. Homeless legislation, their local connection criteria is like 6 out of 12 months or 2 out of 5 years. So it's to bring everything in line.
So are we now in line with our neighbouring authorities? Are they all operating on 2 years as well then?
I can't say that they all are. I don't know offhand. I can get that information and get back to you with that.
If you could, it's just that the last time, from the allocation point of view, from the local connection point of view, the last time this came to council, when our group did highlight that there was a massive difference between our local connection being at 12 months and some of our neighbouring authorities, it was voted down that we actually increased the localisation criteria. So I would like to see how we compare with the neighbouring authorities.
That's
because
no problem.
at that time that we were acting like a magnet for their ones.
Yeah, no problem. I can get that information and get back to you with that. That's not a problem.
Well, the other one is that could you provide us with a copy of the sort of comparison data that you gathered from the registered providers as to how they're operating in comparison? Because obviously we do need to rely on the registered providers to work with the City Council as valued housing providers as well. So it'd be interesting to see how we compare with them as well.
Yes, will do. And as part of this review, I am in consultation with a couple of other registered providers who we do not have nomination agreements with at the moment to get them on board. Because we want to bring more registered providers into our nomination scheme as well.
And my questions are all very much data driven at the moment.
Can I just bring in Julie Griffin, because I think she raised her hand. I don't know whether you wanted to add a particular point on that issue.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I was just going to say what Hayley said about reviewing the nominations arrangements as well. But the main aim of the scheme was that there was, like Councillor Wood has actually said, is that our neighbouring authorities, we're operating differently than us from a local connection criteria. So we will come back to you with the definites, but we were bringing this more in line so that we weren't an outlier, and we were more consistent in line with West Midlands Combined Authority and also the neighbouring authorities. But we'll get you that information and also the registered provider information, Councillor Wood.
Thank you.
Sorry, Chair, the final one with regards to consultation. I think we all have a fear with regards to the actual level of consultation that is carried out by the City Council. With regards to all the people that we claim to have consulted with, can we have some numbers, please, as to actually how many people we spoke to in each of those categories?
Yes, can do. I haven't got those. I know from the public consultation that we did, we had 178 responses from the public. Registered providers, all the registered providers that we deal with, they all responded. But I can get you the exact figures if you would like. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Harmer.
Thank you. Can I ask about something that's not explicitly in this report, which is about the issue of if you have a family who get housing priority and are of a size that would require a 4 or 5 bedroom house and are therefore unable to bid on 3 bedroom houses, as I understand it, they almost always say to you, look, and they're in a 2 bedroom property. They say, look, I'd be very, very happy to get into a 3 bedroom property. And clearly the chances of them finding a 4 or 5 bedroom property through the bidding system are often extremely small. And yet we sort of, as I understand it, we deny them the opportunity to go into a 3 bed, which would considerably improve their circumstances, and is really significant likely opportunity for them. So was that reviewed as part of this?
Yes, it was, and it is included in the new scheme to allow households who are significantly overcrowded the opportunity to bid on a smaller property, so long as by moving into that smaller property, even though it's larger than the one that they've got, it does not make them statutorily overcrowded. So as an example, we have some 3 bedroom properties that are like a parlour type property, where you could use the extra downstairs room as a bedroom. So even though they are advertised as a 3 bedroom, they could potentially become a 4 bedroom property. So applicants would be allowed to bid on those. So, you know, we have addressed that. We've also included in the policy that for larger families who probably need a 6-7 bedroom property, where we know that you know, we've only got 13 of those in the city as a whole, so the likelihood of those becoming available is very slim. So we have also included in the new scheme going forward the possibility of a family being allocated 2 properties, and whether that be 2 properties together, which could be knocked into one larger one, or whether that be 2 separate properties if the households are of the age where they don't mind living separately, because they could have adult children who may be okay to go into live in, you know, in a flat and leave the remaining family in a house. So we have built that provision in as well.
There was a second question, which was about people downsizing.
Yeah.
Amount of priority and support being given. A case that is live at the moment where somebody wants support to downsize and needs support to do that, and is effectively being told to wait in the queue, which seems bizarre to me, because that would free up property that could take someone out of temporary accommodation, or take a family out of temporary accommodation. Yet they're being told you've got to wait 8 weeks for your application to be processed. It will then be given priority because you're downsizing. But don't we need to look at the application process itself, where there are opportunities to get people out of temporary accommodation quicker by giving people priority within the actual application process?
I think we've got Julie with a hand up ready to.
Thank you, Councillor Harmer, and thank you, Chair. Yes, absolutely agree. We need to make sure that that process is as swift as possible. We have a scheme where we do prioritise those that are under occupying to move and incentivise that move as well. And I know a great deal of our colleague registered providers also do the same. But I will take that back about the application process time to see whether that can be improved significantly. You will probably be aware that the whole applications process now has improved quite significantly, and we are aiming to be under 6 weeks very shortly in processing applications, and so we're aiming to improve that, carry on improving that, because we've come a long way with improving that application process. But with regards to downsizing, we do have a scheme, and it should absolutely be that we prioritise those applications to ensure that we get freeing up bigger properties. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Got any further? That's fine. Can I bring in Cass Bridle?
I wanted to ask about housing advice. If increasingly we can't house people as council, we understand that because of the shortage of homes. But I want to know how you get as a resident to get some housing advice. How do you actually get housing advice, and who gives it, and can it be done face to face? including, for example, a discussion about private renting in accordance with the list that I think the council holds, does it, of good private landlords, including a look at a full list of housing associations. And I'm still not quite clear about, because it seems that with some of them, you can still apply direct to those registered social landlords. So how does somebody find out about that? And how does somebody get out of, somebody who's got a very high rent in a private landlord situation that they can't really afford, somebody who's maybe fled from domestic violence, somebody who's got perhaps mental health problems, that kind of person needs some housing advice. So how do they actually get that, and ideally get it face to face comprehensively? That's my question.
So thank you, Julie. You've raised your hand again there.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Bridle. So, with regards to housing advice, you may be aware, but the council is doing a complete review of the advice services that they provide across the whole of the council, and that will span into partners as well, and what services are commissioned. So that's a transformation programme that's going on at the moment, so that we have a very consistent approach to early intervention and prevention, and making sure that we give a range of advice, including housing advice, across the city. To citizens, and it's easy to access. But for the here and now, the Housing Options Centre provides housing advice where information can be given about housing options, housing choices, giving information about the private landlords that we're working with, because we are working with a number of private landlords at the moment on gaining access to good quality, affordable accommodation, and also signposting to housing associations. So the Housing Options Centre does that, and a number of other services do provide housing advice as well, which is, for example, the Neighbourhood Advice Services. The Housing Option Centre do provide appointments on face-to-face basis, so that's where to go to get that early on housing advice. With regards to the high rent, if somebody's got high rent, what they can apply for is support to it's called discretionary housing payment, to support their high rent whilst alternative accommodation is actually found. But again, I would urge people to apply to contact the Housing Options Centre to get that advice on how do we support them to remain in their accommodation whilst trying to find alternative accommodation. We also have access to grant funding to help private renters, which the government awarded us £1.5 million earlier in the autumn of last year. To help support those private renters that may be facing eviction. So again, it's worth people making contact with the Housing Options Centre to discuss their range of options. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course.
Would somebody have to actually go to the Housing Options Centre? Is that still in Newtown? Is that where it is? Or can they get an appointment closer to their home?
Okay, so there's a mixture of services available. So a telephone call, there can be a telephone interview, there can be a sort of a virtual interview, so support so they can get that whilst they're in their own home. Or there is a physical appointments that they can have, which are actually in Newtown at the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Alden.
Yes, I'm just scrolling back trying to find it, but I think you said that there was a new Band D for people who who didn't take up the options, they didn't apply, or they've done too many refusals, and you were making a new band to keep them in. I have to say, if I've understood that correctly, I really don't see why you are, because you've got far too many people on the housing list, not enough properties, and if people have been offered things and either just kept refusing or didn't bother to bid, why should you keep them on the list? That's my first question. The second question is, I represent Edgeworthstown, which has got a number of hotels down Hagley Road, and you will be aware that they're are being used as bed and breakfast accommodation for families who are in the main living in one room with children as well, which is completely unsuitable accommodation. And not surprisingly, they often come to me to say, can you get me a house? Well, I always refer them back to housing options. But I just wondered, how long on average do people stay in that kind of accommodation? bearing in mind you clearly don't own the properties.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll take your first point first, Band D. The reason for demotion is rather than cancelling the application, even though the likelihood of an applicant being allocated a property in Band D is extremely low, it means that an applicant will keep their waiting time. Whereas if we cancelled the application and the applicant then reapplied 12 months later, that waiting time would start from that date. Whereas if we demote an applicant instead, they stay live on the system, so that waiting time is carried with them. So if their circumstances changed within that 12-month period, say someone was subject to domestic abuse as an example, and they were reassessed and they were put back into another band, that waiting time would still be there. So they wouldn't lose that little step forward, if you like, on the register. Secondly, regarding your families in B&B, we have also increased the banding award for families who are in temporary accommodation, well, but everyone who's in temporary accommodation. We aim to reduce the numbers in B&B, especially families. We do have a programme ongoing, a bed and breakfast reduction plan that we are currently working on, and with our aim to reduce the numbers in bed and breakfast, and especially the numbers of families and families in temporary accommodation as a whole. So we have increased the priority going forward, so those families can have more opportunity of being allocated a property.
That's really good news. I'm really pleased to hear that. But you didn't answer my question, which is how long on average are people staying in that kind of accommodation at the moment?
Okay, sorry about that, Councillor. Julie, do you want to pick up there?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Councillor. So on average, it's around about 11 weeks that people are staying into bed and breakfast on average, but we are absolutely working to that to reduce that. What I will say as well is we are receiving unprecedented demand at the moment. Since Christmas, we've been receiving over 400 applications a week, homeless applications. We've never seen that level of demand before, but we have a very robust bed and breakfast elimination plan, and we're working on that, as Hayley has alluded to, and we've got a number of schemes and things in the pipeline in order to reduce that, because we know it is the most unsatisfactory type of accommodation that vulnerable people can find themselves in.
Chairman, could we have that back to the committee? We'd like to hear that, what this plan is, this reduction plan.
Yeah, could we ask for that?
Yes, Chair, of course, yes.
Next municipal year, I dare say.
Thank you.
We can ask for that. Thank you very much. Councillor Sharp.
Thanks, Chair. Can I ask what help is given towards the armed forces, the veterans when they come out, especially if they're injured or they're suffering from PTSD? And the other thing is, do we actually have anybody within the housing department who deals with veterans? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Armed Forces personnel and the new scheme, as in the current scheme, are awarded the highest priority, which is Band 1 and Band A going forward in the new scheme. They also are excluded from any local connection tests, because as we know, if someone served in the armed forces, they may not really have a local connection anywhere in the country because they've probably been serving overseas. So they are exempt from any local connection criteria. That is also includes the bereaved spouses and partners and children of armed forces personnel. So we give them the highest priority, and they do not have to meet any of the qualification criteria. Should they have capital, that is also disregarded. as part of the qualification process. And the second half of your question, I'm sorry, could you just repeat?
Yeah, do you actually have somebody within the housing department to deal with veterans?
I am unsure if there is a Julie.
Yeah, so
Do we have
if
a
I can come in, Chair,
dedicated? Yeah.
if that's okay. So, so just to add to what Hayley said, is not only is the housing allocation scheme going to give priority to armed force personnel and exclude them from the local connection test and exclude any capital that they may have, the homelessness legislation also gives priority status for those that are coming out of the armed forces. So again, that's a fast track into accommodation. So we don't have specific officers within housing to deal with veterans, but all the officers will deal with armed force personnel, those coming out of armed forces, and staff have have been trained on dealing with those people coming out of the armed forces. So we don't have dedicated teams, but staff are trained to actually deal with that personnel. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, can I have an email stating that, please? What has been said today?
You can indeed, Councillor, yes.
Thank you.
Could you actually take the questions that Councillor Wood raised and the questions from Councillor Sharp and put them into one email, and if you send it through overview and scrutiny, then we'll all get a copy of that as a response. Thank you. I can see no more questions in the room. Oh, sorry, Councillor Wood, my apologies, I've got you on my list.
Just one of the most common concerns that are raised with me, not only in my own board but in other boards where people have contacted me, is with regards to us allocating what their term is inappropriate and disruptive tenants into our over 55 schemes, whether they're supported or whether they're just basically over 55. Is the allocation policy, I take it that will be on the next level down, but we need to be a lot more choosy by the looks of things of who we allow to go into those over 55 schemes, because they're clearly causing problems in certain areas of the city.
And perhaps can I just add to that, because also I've seen younger residents being placed into bungalow accommodation, which I know is an absolute premium for some of our older residents, and I've seen 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds being put into that accommodation. So that kind of links with Councillor Wood's comment. I don't know, Julie, you can answer that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll take those back and explore those further as to the criteria that's been applied there. What I would say and what I would always encourage my officers to do is to ensure that when they are doing any allocations or lettings, is that they look at the property being not only fit for purpose for the incoming tenant, but for the local community as well. But I realise on occasions that from what Councillor Wood is saying is that that doesn't appear to have happened. So I will go back to my teams and understand what criteria is being applied at that letting stage, and also from yourself, Chair, about younger people going into bungalows. So I will go back and revisit how those are actually being allocated and let.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if there's a disability, one would understand it, but my understanding has been a couple of my wards, certainly, where that hasn't been the case. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
I see no more questions in the room, so can I thank you both very much for coming along this afternoon. I don't think we need to do anything with your review, because I believe you're taking it to Cabinet, aren't you? And they are a higher body to see. So thank you very much for both of you. It's been very useful. Thank you,
Chair.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right, so the next thing on our list for this afternoon is the housing allocations review. No, sorry, apologies, we just the progress report on the implementation and on the reduction of fly tipping. Now, we requested, I think, at the last meeting, more information on reducing fly tipping. I think there were particular things we asked about: the camera locations, fixed penalty notices, engagements and warning notices. And I know Councillor John O'Shea sent us apologies, so I'm not sure, is it Martin Smith is here to take us through that?
Yes, good afternoon all.
Thank you very much.
Apologies, my microphone might be breaking up a little bit, but hopefully it will work fine. From the last meeting, the committee asked for information in relation to two aspects. One was the camera locations, which I believe that the Cabinet member has sent through. And then through Councillor Davis, as Chair of the Licensing and Public Protection Committee, a request was made as to whether he felt that the committee, or his committee, ought to review the process and approaches and protocols around issuing fixed penalty notices. I believe Councillor Davis has circulated around a note, a briefing note, which I sent to him on that subject. Is that correct?
No, what we have is your report in red, the areas that we've been addressed.
I'm ever so sorry that broke up there.
So what we have is we've got your report, your progress report, and the 10th of March we've got the sites that you've outlined for where those cameras are, and then for the other one, there's 2 paragraphs in red. I don't know whether you've got that report in front of you. It's on R03.
It's attached as appendix 1, it says, doesn't it?
Oh, it does, doesn't it? Except we've got a copy of the letter.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? The dear statutory information demand, household duty of care, I'd like to think.
No, it's just that's the letter, isn't it?
It's touching, yeah.
That's the only letter we've got.
Yeah.
So we haven't had a letter, you said, from
Yes.
Councillor Davis?
No.
We haven't had anything from him. Sorry, I don't know whether you're not unmuted.
Is that better? Yeah. Right. Yes, Councillor Davis had asked whether it was fine for him to circulate the briefing note which I'd sent to him. Councillor Davis had posed a number of questions to me to assist him determine whether his committee needed to review how fixed penalty notices are issued. And he had indicated that he was going to send it to the chair and for potential onward forwarding to yourselves on the committee. So apologies if that hasn't happened, but I wasn't part of that side of it. So the follow-up part to that was a request for the letter or an example template letter that we may send to an individual where we don't have categoric evidence with which to commence enforcement action. So, for example, not enough information to issue a fixed penalty notice or even to look towards prosecuting. So if I can cover that bit first, the example template letter that you have there with the tracker, that's not always the style that might be used. And the reason for that is that dependent upon the kind of referral that we receive, they might range, for example, from somebody who's reported something completely anonymously. So we have no further information than an anonymous allegation. We can't verify anything or we can't check any details. We might not even be able to check dates and circumstances. For those kinds of reports, we have to be guarded about what we might suggest or allege to an alleged offender about what they may or may not have done. At the other end of the spectrum, there are reports that come to us and they may be very categoric. The witness may be very credible, but it just might be that they're unwilling to actually give us a witness statement to work on and use. Those kinds of reports, it is, shall we say, easier to be more robust with the correspondence or the engagement that we might have with an alleged offender. So that the template that I've included with the tracker, I would probably describe as sort of a middle ground kind of engagement and warning letter. So that was the first part. In terms of Councillor Davis's request to myself for an update, one of the matters which I believe is considered relates to the review that takes place periodically of the regulation and enforcement policy. So that covers the activities of all authorised officers that report through that committee, and the waste enforcement unit and the authorised officers in my team report through that committee and using that enforcement policy. So the fixed penalty notices for fly tipping are one of a range of fixed penalty notices that are used. And within that enforcement policy, that's a document which is consulted upon each time the policy goes out for review. I believe it was last reviewed in August 2020, and it is, I understand, due for review shortly anyway. It also gives the opportunity to identify or to promote what the council's approach is, not just to enforcement practices in general, but it also gives the ability to be specific about certain types of offences. And one of them, which is specifically referenced in the policy, covers waste crime offences. So, for example, it sets out that our starting point ordinarily and invariably is an enforcement route rather than an engagement route. And then the next stage of that enforcement policy, it identifies the activities that the authorised officers have to do and what they must have regard to before they commence that enforcement action. So the issuing of a fixed penalty notice is based upon the evidence that the officer has at any one moment in time, but also two other documents. One of those documents is the statutory guidance issued by DEFRA, and that's the one which indicates that where a fixed penalty notice is issued for fly tipping, if that fixed penalty notice were not to be paid, the statutory guidance which we have to have regard to is that we must or we should prosecute the offender. So between ourselves and in terms of the service delivery unit and the council's legal services, one of the things that we do is we meet on a fairly regular basis to assess our approach or the council's approach and to review. So as it stands at the moment, through the enforcement policy, the umbrella of that publicly published policy offers a robust framework for how we issue fixed penalty notices. The last document that enforcement policy or the council's enforcement policy references is what officers have to do when they make decisions about the appropriateness of taking enforcement action. And that links to a document from the Crown Prosecution Service. It's called the Code for Crown Prosecutors. So I'm aware that one of the sort of key concerns of the committee was around do we use fixed penalty notices and do we use them robustly enough? So the key point is that the framework that controls the use of them is there and it's published, and it's the committee's approach or the enforcement policy's approach. In terms of the operational delivery and the use of fixed penalty notices, last year we increased the use of fixed penalty notices by around about a third, 33%. And we also increased the number of prosecution reports that were concluded through court. And we've done that principally by targeting more those smaller scale fly tipping incidents, which we know are a particular problem citywide. So by changing that focus under the framework of the enforcement policy, it's very much fixed penalty notices will serve their appropriate purpose, and that was to try and deter those small scale offenders without the need for the council to take those offenders to court. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I can see the slide.
Recommendation 3 from us, from our committee, was that a review of prosecution strategies for fly tipping, in particular the use of fixed penalty notices with a view to adopting the barking and dagenham approach, should be undertaken to ensure that this fits what is needed currently. It says against that, Cabinet members' assessment 1. I don't think that can be right, because it hasn't been, the review hasn't been done. Also, I want to know who is, we're talking about Councillor Davis. Councillor Davis isn't a Cabinet member, so who is the Cabinet member who has the authority to agree a change to our enforcement policy that Martin's referred to? It's obviously not Phil Davis, it's somebody else. I think I know who it is, but I'd be interested in hearing what who the officer thinks it is. And surely it's that person that has to decide whether they've done this review or not. So who has put a number 1 against Cabinet members' assessment here? Because I just don't think that's right.
Or do you think that's a hangover from last time we did, because we sent it back, didn't we? Say
We did.
Yes.
But
Are you able
need
to
that clarified? Who's in charge of making a policy change to our enforcement policy, which will enable us to go for a broke on this fixed penalty notices, which is what Barking and Dagenham seem to be doing with no problem, because I remember them saying that they didn't ever lose a case should it have to go to court. So that was my first point.
Should we take that one? Are you able to answer that one too?
Yes, hopefully, Chair. The position in respect of regulation and enforcement activities, although there's a scheme of delegations through the City Council's constitution, how we undertake enforcement has to be covered by a framework document called an enforcement policy. We're statutorily obliged to have an enforcement policy. Now, that policy is administered through the Licensing and Public Protection Committee as the key regulatory committee of the City Council. So it's the Licensing and Public Protection Committee which oversees the delivery and review and any amendments to the enforcement policy that my officers operate under. And it covers all the enforcement activities undertaken by any of the legislation delegated through the Licensing and Public Protection Committee. So the Cabinet member for Street Scene and Parks, I may sort of best describe that in terms of the overarching policy for those areas that the Council delivers around street scene and parks. But the regulatory activity is entirely controlled through the enforcement policy of the Licensing and Public Protection Committee. So apologies that you may not have the briefing note that I've sent to Councillor Davis in his capacity as the chair of the Licensing and Public Protection Committee. But he posed a number of questions to myself, and what he was, I believe, trying to do was basically assess whether it was necessary, for example, to review fixed penalty notices specifically for fly tipping in the context of the enforcement policy which exists to cover all kinds of enforcement, including the use of fixed penalty notices of all types and the activities of my team. And he'd asked me, the first question was, sort of in practical terms, what will be required to increase the use of fly tipping fixed penalty notices? The second question posed was, would the current council enforcement policy require amendment, and if so, how? And then he'd asked me a specific question on a matter that he'd raised with myself. So it was those 2 points really that he sought information and clarification from myself on. And that briefing note was submitted to Councillor Davis, and it posed the question as to whether it was okay to circulate that through the chair. And obviously I said yes, because I tried to set out the backdrop to that enforcement policy. Does that make sense, Chair?
I think that does, but we haven't seen it, so I think we're going to have to refer it back again and have it brought to the first meeting of the new municipal year of this overview and scrutiny, unfortunately.
And also, Chair, I still can't quite understand that a regulatory chair who isn't a cabinet member can be in charge of a change to a regulation policy.
You can't.
Surely that has to be a cabinet level responsibility.
Can't do it in a regulation.
That's perhaps not for Martin to answer, but it's perhaps a question we can pose to the officers of the scrutiny committee to find out, because it does seem a little anomalous, doesn't it?
Well, if we're going to change, we're asking for a review, the potential change in policy. So we need to know who the cabinet member is that
oversees the.
Yeah.
So we will not take this any further. Well, we'll continue on our questions today, but we'll. I think we just need to probably take that back. Did you have further questions?
I was just going to say on the letter, Chair, that Martin submitted here as an example. I was a bit surprised in the letter. I can see what we're trying to do here, which I think is a good thing. But don't the people who respond to this letter, who are being kind of possibly accused of taking part in fighting, don't have to quote a reference number of some kind?
You know, I've got exactly the same thing.
They just write
Yeah, because it just seemed to me it was just a click onto this flight at birmingham.gov.uk. But was there anything on that letter? I couldn't see that actually said reference with a number.
There's also no demand for them to respond.
No, it sounded, I thought, very weak actually.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
There is no demand from the City Council for a response.
Just contact here if you hear.
So Martin, I think you've got your hand up. Are you able to give us an answer to that?
Yes, through you, Chair. And that's why I gave this other context. It's just a template document. So the officers issuing those would give the references that we hold on our system, our sort of log numbers, as it were. They would give all their own details to be contacted. So apologies, it's not that they've been left off on purpose. I just didn't think it was necessary to actually include some of the details that we might include within that correspondence.
And you're saying
if that makes sense.
This is a mini letter, the stronger one, lighter touch one, are you suggesting?
Yes, Chair, that's exactly correct, in the sense that we have to tailor the correspondence to the circumstances and the details that we're presented with, because it isn't possible to have a one size fits all, and in most respects that's probably best anyway, because ultimately we're not seeking, for example, just to send out correspondence. We're trying to deter any future behaviour which causes problems in the locality. So attempting to tailor for each case and circumstance, we hope hits home. So for example, where we have photographs of what the dumped item is, that can sometimes be much more impactful than the letter itself. They know that somebody's reported it, they know that we know what it is. So we tailor those documents as the need requires, really.
And will it later be taken up with £250 to collect this and remove this? This is a bill, or is it just left?
No, Councillor, I think one of the practical things for ourselves is that one of the messages that we do convey sometimes in those letters, depending on the circumstances, is the cost of clean-up. There are some situations where material might have been left and it may well have been collected by the council in the course of, for example, the weekly scheduled collection. Intrinsically, there might not have been any additional cost to that activity, but the material perhaps shouldn't have been left there. There are other circumstances, though, where something might be dumped either away from a normal collection round or between collections. In those circumstances, there is likely to be real additional expense, time and effort incurred. And where we can factor that in, we will include that within the letter. And as I said, that's to do with making that letter a real document, if that makes sense, really, making it a live thing rather than just another document from the council. So yes, we will include collection costs to give an indication of why on earth we're doing this in the first place and why we want the behaviour to change or stop.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
3 people want to take questions, 4 people who do take questions, I think all stemming from that. So have you got anything further you wanted to say? So if we go to Councillor Harmer first.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The question I had was on the figures that you gave. You mentioned, I think, a 33% increase last year in terms of the fixed penalty notices issued. But my concern is that, of course, if you're comparing 2021 with 2020, 2020 was by far, was very far from being an ordinary year. So is that increase over pre-COVID levels, or is it over a very depressed first year of COVID? And how do the current levels of prosecution or issuing of fixed penalty notices compare, for example, with a council like Barking and Dagenham, obviously adjusted pro rata for the difference in the size of the council, but how far away are we from being at their level? And obviously, it may well be that you don't know that, but can we find out?
Yes, through you, Chair. I'm sure we can find out the details from Barking and Dagenham. I'm sure that they wouldn't mind providing those to us. In terms of the impact that COVID had, at the beginning of COVID, Birmingham, like most local authorities, had a surge in reports of fly tipping, which may have been a factor of more people being at home and other reasons, but there was a surge. In terms of those reports that came through to us, and the years before and subsequently, the overriding factor and key bit which is important to us is the actual evidence which is given to us. So if we have something to work on evidentially and we can progress those, then we will do. So a lot of the reports that we had during COVID or at the outset of COVID were from people who wanted to be eyewitnesses. And that was unusual because often people are reticent about being eyewitnesses. So although the reports were very high at the outset of COVID, individuals, residents were willing to be witnesses and to make a statement. But that's now gone back to what it was pre-COVID. So less inclination to give witness statements, but they may still want to report the problem. So that's a fundamental change, I think, that the numbers have now gone back to what they were pre-COVID, and also the likelihood of people wishing to give a witness statement to back up enforcement. So the increase in fixed penalty notice issuing and effectively the increase in prosecutions concluded at court really is a factor of the number of reports to us that came along with evidence that we could use as evidence for either the issue of the fixed penalty notice or court proceedings. Does that answer your question, Councillor?
Yes, sort of. So basically, just to clarify, what you're saying is that the increase was not the result of a change of policy by Birmingham City Council. It was a change in circumstances which made it possible for a temporary period to issue more fixed penalty notices. But nothing fundamental has changed in the way the increase is likely to lead to a long-term increase.
No, Councillor, through you, Chair, the situation in relation to the use of fixed penalty notices, we have done a couple of key things. The first one is around the actual use of fixed penalty notices in the first instance. So one of the things about the statutory guidance issued by DEFRA. It gives local authorities a definition of what small-scale fly tipping is. So that, for example, in their words, would include items that would fit in the boot of a small car, or, again, their words, a couple of black sacks. Now, one of the practical considerations is that, I've got an average car, but I wouldn't get a mattress in the boot. I wouldn't get an item of furniture in the boot. But if that item was fly tipped, what we may have done previously would have been reported that offender for prosecution if we had evidence. And that's because it didn't fit within DEFRA's definition of small scale. Now, that in itself is fine. However, there is a cost incurred in prosecution. And the idea of fixed penalty notices is that they are meant to be that short, sharp financial shock for somebody. So one of the practical things that we've done is we've shifted the threshold at which we will prosecute. So, for example, those larger, bulky items, which may not entirely fit within the DEFRA guidance and instructions to councils, we're seeking to deal with those as fixed penalty fine matters rather than prosecution matters. The second thing that we are doing is that we don't determine what offenders get fined at court. It's a matter for court. Often fines can be relatively low, and sometimes they're not far short of what an offender might have had to pay being issued with a £400 fixed penalty notice. So now we are much more actively seeking to issue fixed penalty fines rather than reporting for prosecution, given our knowledge of sometimes what the fines might be through the court service. So with those two things, that's migrated our approach to issuing fixed penalty notices. But that's not a change in policy. That's an operational change that is appropriate to be done under the enforcement policy, which is the overarching policy which governs how authorised officers of the council can and should conduct their enforcement activities, if that makes sense.
Let's try again. So what you say, we're going to court less, but we're issuing and replacing some of those court actions with more fixed penalty notices. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is the chance of someone fly tipping, has it increased, or is it just that those people that used to be taken to court are now being issued with fixed penalty notices, so the overall level of activity hasn't really changed?
Through you, Chair, one of the things which is difficult for ourselves to know is that when somebody is reported to court and they're prosecuted, they're convicted, it's hard to track, we're not able to track, whether they might go on and offend again in the future. When we issue a fixed penalty fine, we can track, for example, the percentage of those fixed penalty fines which are paid. And for those people who pay those fixed penalties, and it's approximately around 70% of those pay their fixed penalties, the FPN level within Birmingham is set at £400. Now that is quite a substantive amount to pay, and we hope and we anticipate that kind of financial impact is significant enough to make somebody think twice about offending again and potentially being caught again. So from our own figures, we believe that fixed penalty notices are potentially an active deterrent in a way where we can attempt to monitor the effectiveness of them, where it's much more difficult to do that through court activity and prosecutions. Thank you, Chair.
I don't know what was going because I don't dispute anything you just said. It's just you're talking to a different point from the one I'm making. I can quite see why it might entirely be far more logical to go down the fixed penalty notice and a court action for the reasons you've just given, but that wasn't, and that's great. But my question was a different one, which is trying to get at what is is what we've seen, a shift for great reasons from court action to fixed penalty notices, but the overall level of activity is the same? Or has there been a change in the overall level of activity, which means that more people are taken into the prosecution process, whether that's court or fixed penalty notices?
Yes, I mean, through you, Chair, I think one of the key aspects of this is that the enforcement regime is one which is about sanctioning individuals where we have sufficient evidence. But the follow-up activities to it in terms of changing behaviours, and you're quite right, Councillor, in the sense that the whole aim is not just to seek to penalise as many individuals as possible. It's to have that bulk deterrent effect on those that might either want to decide to offend or might be offenders on a regular basis. So it's tied into the wider campaign, for example, the crime wall, and seeking to raise the profile of fly tipping and the impact that it has on the city, but also the work being done to try and mitigate that in terms of community engagement activities, in terms of focus cleanup, etc., but also promoting those court case outcomes and promoting that enforcement activity. So that cumulative package, we hope, will have that impact across the board, as opposed to just one individual enforcement tool, because on its own, enforcement won't deliver what we need to do across the city. It's part of a package of activities.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I've next got Councillor Locke.
It's okay.
It's been covered, lovely. So Councillor Alden.
Yeah, my question is about the locations of these cameras, which I asked for, and we've got them. I did raise this with Councillor O'Shea at a meeting with him on Monday, but I didn't get an answer that satisfied me, because I remain very concerned that at the beginning they put up 5, I think it's 5, and 2 were in one ward. And Councillor O'Shea said, oh, well, they go by the locations that are bad, which of course I understand. But was it really the case that of the first 5 locations in the city, 2 were in one ward? I find that hard to believe, to be honest. There are loads that we all know, there are loads of places where fly tipping is, and then they've got some more then coming online in the next few weeks. But I just think that to me, that leaves a nasty taste, that 2 are in one ward and most of us are not going to get one. And as I say, it's not even a ward which I would have flagged up as, if you'd asked me off the top of my head, what do you think is the worst ward in the city? I wouldn't have said North Edgeworthstown. So I'm not happy about that. And I think even if it was, wouldn't the person arranging the sites have said, it looks really bad actually to put 2 in one ward, so let's go to the next site and do that and put that in later. I just think it would have better. The other thing is about these cameras. Exactly what are they like? Are they covert or overt? In other words, if I drove around North Edgeworthstown, would I be able to see them? Are they a dome on a lamppost and I would be able to say, that's one of them? Or are they, for example, hidden in someone's bedroom pointing at an alleyway that no one is ever going to know, so they really are hidden and they should catch people? Or do we have to put a sign up, like the police have to if they're doing a speed gun exercise, to say, we're doing a speed gun exercise here? Is there a sign saying, we're looking for fly tipping here? What exactly are they like?
So my understanding from the last meeting was that they were covert rather than overt, but I don't know how.
But that's what I mean. They might not be advertising them, but would I be able to see them if I looked? Or are they really hidden away that no one would be able to see them?
So I think your first point is probably about the positioning we need to send back to the cabinet member, possibly, or perhaps Martin, are you able to address both those issues?
Yes, hopefully through you, Chair. The use of the cameras can be split into 2 types of categories. We use cameras sometimes as part of targeted operations. So we're using them as a tool within a wider investigation. So the determination of a location to put a camera might be as part of that targeted operation. The second way of using cameras is to identify the locations around the city that are generally being heavily affected by fly tipping. So it's not part of a specific targeted operation. It's because that area is affected heavily by fly tipping. So in terms of where those cameras are going, the initial focus is on those locations which have the highest frequency, or what we might describe as the highest incidence of fly tipping. The rollout of cameras beyond that, we're looking to use those cameras in areas which I would describe, for example, as having a relatively high prevalence. So it's fair to say that different wards will have different levels of fly tipping, different frequencies of fly tipping, for a whole range of reasons. But the wards as a whole are still affected by fly tipping. So the use of the cameras is not being restricted to only the worst wards. It's essential that we target also based around prevalence, and that's because no matter where you live in the city, you can be impacted by fly tipping, whether it be where you live or where you travel to and from work or the park, etc. So the idea is, through the assessment as to where cameras should be deployed, we're looking to factor in both of those elements. So the frequency, the incidence of fly tipping, but also that spread of fly tipping across the wards. In terms of actually what cameras look like, when it's a covert usage, that covert usage will have been authorised by the court, and it will vary as to the kind of equipment that we use and the site that we install the equipment at. But in effect, really, all I can sort of outline is that the entire aim of those operations is to make the observation covert if it's an observation which is being authorised through the court. And we'll go about making that activity covert in a range of ways. I hesitate to go on to provide more details around that because it's perhaps something that I didn't ought to do. But it's sometimes possible that cameras may be evident, but you might not know what they're there for. Other times it shouldn't be evident that there are cameras there, and it depends on the circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
I'm sort of slightly puzzled now because as a committee, we asked for new cameras, and it sounds like this is not a new camera that's been bought to do as it's something that was halfway through the court anyway, and the court decided there should be something there. It doesn't sound like this is quite what we asked for, does it? I don't think. It sounds like they were going to do that anyway, and it's a camera we stuck there. Whereas we thought we were getting completely new cameras in completely new places to catch people fighting and you've never been caught before. That's what I thought we were getting, but it doesn't sound like it is. It sounds like, well, we were going to put a camera there anyway, and we're classing that as one of yours. That's why. Doesn't sound very satisfactory, I don't think.
So am I taking that from the committee that we're sending R01 and R03 back?
Yes. Yes.
Could do better.
So that is the consensus.
The cabinet member is on R03,
Mhm.
and we want an assurance from the cabinet member, whoever that is, that there is going to be a review of prosecution strategies in accordance with getting towards the barking and daggering approach. That's what we've asked for.
I thought you were going to have this camera for every ward.
I didn't think we were going to get them for every ward. I thought we were going to have them moving around. That's what they were going to do. Agile and cropping up, doing a week and then going somewhere else, and maybe some dummy cameras at the same time.
Because I had some in my ward, and Martin helped me get them, and that's replied to the court, and they were there for, I think, 3 months, and it did do the trick. But it's not too bad, but there is charges, and we all get it, and there are. I could all name several places that
So they were for the covert cameras have to go through the port, but you can stick over ones as long as you've got a big sign saying we're watching you. So I think I'm taking from the committee that we're going to send this back again, R01, R03, for some additional information on that, and that will come to the first meeting of the next one. I can't see any more questions in the room. Did you have one? Sorry, Councillor.
Yeah, I just want to make one general comment, based on, given some of the working around recommendation 3, is the timeline. It was soft scheduled for completion in March 2021. Here we are a year later, and part of the response we get is that we batted it back to the Licensing and Public Protection Committee, so the use of fixed penalty notices can form part of a periodic review of their enforcement policy. Why didn't we do that 12 months ago? This is why nothing happens in this city. I find that extremely frustrating that 12 months, 1 year, 365 days later, we're actually no further on than we were.
Yeah.
I think it is ridiculous and unacceptable.
Well, let's back those two back and ask
That's true.
to the first meeting of the next municipal year. I do recognise that we're running out of time, but if we could move on from that, just to quickly look at the work programme, if you have got a moment. There were two things that I think really we need to discuss, and they were the two things which are going to be carried through. The first one is the voids, I think. So we've got further working proposals for that. But secondly, we talked about the tenant review. But in the other things, and I think that's one that we do need to talk about, is the litter bins policy. So what I was, the message I think I was getting about that was our meetings with Bradford and Knowsley have both been useful, but I think what it has flagged up is that, more bins doesn't make less litter. That in actual fact, we haven't been inspired particularly by what we've heard from, I think Bradford is quite useful. But perhaps what we need to do is to look at a wider strategy around litter, which I always consider is mini fly tipping, because that's essentially what it is. It's a Coke can and a crisp packet rather than a 3 bin bags full of pasta or whatever. And I think it just brought up that we perhaps need to look at it as part of a scope of wider litter policies. And just wondered whether we really wanted to look at a wider strategy. So, Councillor Bridle, do you want to come up?
Well, I just agree with that. I think the more we've heard about litter bins, the more it makes me feel that we need a litter strategy. In Birmingham, we've got rid of a lot of litter bins, but we've had no campaign or message to explain why we've done that, to get people to think about not dropping litter. So that's been missing. In Bradford said, we read the notes on that, but in areas that had most litter, there were most bins. So clearly bins aren't the answer. So I just think we do need a proper strategy in Birmingham, a litter strategy.
And
I think
I did actually witness in Erdington a fixed penalty notice being given out to someone who had dropped litter. They don't know their campaign.
That is
Stopped and just.
No, it's a response to the petition I put in, which was to say, don't just put issue fixability notices in the city centre, because 99% of the work. And the response to that petition is they will start to do that in local centres outside of the city centre. So that has been, that policy has actually slightly changed. But that thing about the causal link there is ludicrous, because you put litter bins where there's a lot of rubbish. I mean, it's a bit like saying, well, most people die of heart attacks in hospitals. Well, therefore, shut down all hospitals and people won't die of heart attacks. I mean, there's no logic here.
So what I was going to propose, and I understand the Scottish Government are actually looking at a litter strategy at the moment, and they're looking at 3 things, they're looking at behavioural change, they're looking at services and infrastructure and enforcement as a package. And I just felt that rather than just look at litter bins, I think certainly what I've seen, and I haven't been on the committee as long as you have, what I have seen, that didn't seem to be resolving any particular issue except moving the litter bins around. And I just felt perhaps what we should do is be suggesting that we actually take on something bigger and we look at a wider litter strategy, which may or may not include lighting within that. So would you be happy with that being put forward to the next municipal year? Lovely. That's fine. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up about
the work programme as well?
Well,
the work programme?
I had a question. Obviously, that's been agreed. This the implication of voids. So obviously, you'll have two competing pieces of work potentially. Not saying it's impossible, but I think realistically, doing two pieces of work at the same time would I think put a big resource issue on yourself, the committee, but also this. What's the priority? Is it voids? Is it this piece of work?
Do you think we should leave that to the new committee? Because who knows what's going to happen in there? I know certainly I'm retiring, so I'm not going to be here. There will be a new committee.
And me.
There we go. So could we leave that as a proposal for the new committee in May, June, whenever?
That's something I wanted to bring up for the after my, looking at begging, and the public space protection order, lockdown time.
Right. So let's put forward, we know we've got voids going forward. Can we put forward the possibility of looking into wider litter strategy across the city? And then let's see who else is on the committee. I don't really want to put forward two. Is everyone has that?
Yeah.
Lovely. So that just leaves the date of the next meeting, the 14th of April, cancelled. I'm not sure when the next one will be in the next municipal year, so we'll leave that standing. There are nothing to consider for Pauline. I understand no other urgent business. Therefore, can I move that in the notice situation between meetings, the chair, jointly with the relevant chief officer, has the authority to act on behalf of the committee? Thank you very much, and thank you. I have enjoyed our short time with you.
And Mike as well.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.